At 70 years of age, a man is supposed to be a monument, not dust. But for Abner, the dust was all that was left. It coated the back of his throat, a fine grit of defeat from the road his own son's horse had just galloped down. The finality of it was not in the slammed door of his ranch house or the cold click of the new padlock on the gate. It was in the silence that followed, a silence that consumed the familiar lowing of his cattle, the creak of the porch swing, the very rhythm of the life he had built from bedrock and bone. Mr. Croft, the banker, had stood there with a face as smooth and unforgiving as a river stone, his papers held out like a verdict. Abner's son, Thomas, had stood beside him, his gaze fixed on some distant point over his father's shoulder, a point where progress and profit presumably lived. The conversation had been brief, clinical. A series of bad seasons, a loan called in, the inexorable logic of numbers on a ledger. Abner had not argued. Arguing with a ledger was like arguing with the tide. He felt the ache in his knuckles, a deep, arthritic throb that had been his companion for a decade, and he knew this pain was more real than any signature on Croft's documents. He was a fact of the earth, they were a theory of ownership. But their theory had won. Thomas had offered a final, hollow platitude. "It's for the best, Pa." A new way of doing things. You can't fight the future as the future. To Abner, the future had always been the next season, the next calf, the slow, steady accumulation of work and worth. To his son, it was an abstraction, a clean slate that required his father's erasure. He had been given an hour to gather his things. He took his father's old knife, a tinderbox, the worn woolen blanket his wife, Sarah, had woven, and the canteen on his hip. He left behind the photographs, the furniture worn smooth by his own hands, the history. Carrying it would be like carrying a ghost. As he walked away from the gate, he did not look back. To look back would be to give them the satisfaction of his grief. He focused instead on the mechanics of walking, the protest of his left knee, the way the setting sun cast his long, stooped shadow before him, leading him into an unknown and uncharitable wilderness. He was a man with a 70-year history, and it had all just been rendered worthless. The chill came first for his hands, then his feet, a creeping, invasive cold that felt less like a temperature and more like a judgment. He had walked until the sun was a faint, bruised smear on the horizon and the land had turned from familiar pasture to a hostile geography of sharp-edged rock and thorny scrub. He found a shallow overhang, a stony lip in the earth that offered little more than a break from the relentless wind. He huddled beneath it, pulling Sarah's blanket tight around his shoulders. The wool was thin in places, a map of their years together, and it smelled faintly of her, of wood smoke and dried lavender. A memory, sharp and painful as a shard of ice, surfaced, Sarah, her hands covered in flour, laughing in their sunlit kitchen. "You're stubborn as this mountain, Abner," she'd said. "You'll outlast it," he had believed her then. Now, the mountain felt eternal, and he felt like a single, dying ember. Despair was not a sharp, sudden thing. It was a slow, seeping dampness, a cold that worked its way past the blanket and into his very marrow. He was nothing. A relic. A failed rancher whose own blood had signed away his legacy. He thought of Thomas, not with anger, but with a profound, aching pity. The boy had been so eager to shed the past, so convinced that newness was the same as worth. He didn't understand that you can't build a future without a foundation, and Abner had been his foundation. Now, they were both unmoored. The night deepened, and the world was reduced to the rasp of his own breathing and the frantic, hollow beat of his heart. The pain in his joints was a constant, grinding reminder of his age, of his vulnerability. Each breath was a conscious effort, a tiny rebellion against the crushing weight of his solitude. He pressed his face into the rough texture of the blanket, trying to find a trace of warmth, a memory of a life that felt as distant as a star. This was the dark night he had always heard about in whispers, the place where a man's soul is weighed. And as he lay there, shivering under a sky indifferent and vast, he felt utterly, terrifyingly light. He had nothing left to lose, which meant he had nothing left to fight for. The cold was winning. He did not know if he slept, but when a sliver of grey light broke the horizon, he found the will to move. It was a mechanical process, a command sent from some deep, forgotten part of his brain that refused to surrender. He forced his stiff limbs to obey, rising with a groan that was swallowed by the immense silence. He walked on, driven by a primal instinct for water. By midday, his canteen was empty, and his tongue was thick in his mouth. That's when he saw it, nestled in a fold of the hills, not a town, but the ghost of one. A few dilapidated structures, their spines broken, their faces weathered into masks of decay. A sign, its paint almost entirely stripped by the elements, hung from a single hinge: redemption. The irony was a bitter pill. He limped down the single dusty street, past hollow doorways that gaped like open mouths. In the center of this ruin was a post office, or what was left of it. Nailed to the warped door was a single, yellowed piece of paper, a notice of sale for delinquent taxes. It listed a property at the edge of the settlement, a stone cottage and the small parcel of land it sat on. The price was $7. Abner reached into his pocket. He had $9 and a few cents, the last of his physical worth in the world. He spent the next hour tracking down the county clerk, a weary man operating out of a nearby, more populated town. The clerk barely looked at him, stamped the deed with a tired thud, and took his money. "It's a ruin," the clerk said, his voice flat. "The roof is gone." "No one's lived there in 40 years, Abner merely nodded and took the paper. He walked back to redemption, to his new possession. The clerk was right. It was a ruin. The roof was a skeleton of charred timbers, and the north wall had collapsed inward, filling the single room with a mountain of stone and earth. But the other 3 walls, built of thick, well-set river stone, were still standing. They were defiant. He pushed his way inside through the collapsed doorway. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. He began to pace the small space, his boots crunching on fallen debris. It was in the center of the room, where the floor had rotted through, that he found it. He kicked at a loose clod of earth and saw something else beneath. He knelt, his knees screaming in protest, and dug with his bare, gnarled fingers. Under a thin layer of topsoil was a seam of clay, rich and gray and smooth as butter. It was potter's clay, the kind that fired strong and true. And beside it, almost completely buried, was a stone-lined circle. A well. He pushed aside the debris and, with a monumental effort, lifted the heavy, rotten wood covering. The air that rose up was cool and clean, with no hint of stagnation. The water was still there. Deep and dark and waiting. He stood up, his body aching, and looked from the clay at his feet to the defiant stone walls around him. This place was not a grave. It was a seed. The work began with a single stone. He wrapped his stiff, swollen fingers around a piece of the collapsed wall, feeling its weight, its rough texture. It was heavy, an honest weight. He lifted it, his back groaning a litany of complaints, and set it aside. Then he picked up another. And another. For days, this was his life. Dawn would find him already at work, and dusk would force him to stop, his body trembling with exhaustion. He was not clearing a room, he was excavating his own future. The pile of salvaged stones grew slowly, a testament to his obstinacy. He worked with a methodical, unhurried rhythm, the same rhythm he had used to mend fences and birth calves. There was a language in the labor, a conversation between his will and the world's indifference. His hands, once accustomed to the soft leather of rains, were now raw and blistered. The skin broke, bled, and hardened into a new kind of armor. At night, he would sleep in the one corner of the ruin that was partially protected by an overhang of the remaining roof joists, wrapped in Sarah's blanket, the cold stone at his back a constant, solid presence. He ate little, foraging for roots and berries he recognized from his youth, his hunger a dull ache that sharpened his focus. He was stripping his life down to its essential elements: shelter, water, work. After the rubble was cleared, he turned his attention to the clay. He dug it out with his hands and his father's knife, mixing it with water from the well and tough grasses he'd gathered from the hillside. He was making daub, a crude but effective mortar to seal the gaps in the standing walls. He worked it into the cracks, his palms pushing the thick, cool mud deep into the stone, sealing the structure against the wind. Each smear of clay was an act of defiance, a declaration that he was still here. He was not just patching a wall, he was mending a life. He found a rhythm in the repetition: dig, mix, carry, apply. The sun beat down on his back, sweat tracing paths through the grime on his face. He talked to himself sometimes, or perhaps to Sarah, his voice a low murmur. Just one more stone, old man. Just one more seam. He was not driven by hope, not yet. Hope was a luxury. He was driven by something more fundamental: purpose. The purpose of the next stone, the next bucket of water, the next handful of clay. In this grueling, painstaking process, he was not just rebuilding a house. He was proving to the universe, and to the ghost of his own despair, that he was not a ruin. He was a foundation. The first frost was a warning, a delicate white lacework that rhymed the stones of his growing walls. It was beautiful and terrifying. Winter was a predator, and he was still too exposed. The need for a roof became urgent, a primal imperative that overshadowed the constant ache in his body. He scavenged the charred timbers from the original collapse. Most were useless, but some, where the fire had only licked the surface, were salvageable. He spent days scraping away the charcoal with his knife until he reached the solid, unburnt heartwood beneath. The labor was tedious, filling the air with black dust that he breathed in, that coated his skin, but each clean timber was a victory. He needed to bridge the gap between the walls. Using a leverage system of rocks and his own dwindling strength, he began the Herculean task of raising the beams. More than once, a beam slipped, crashing down with a sound that echoed his own fragility. But he would simply stand, take a deep, ragged breath, and begin again. He was too old for this work. The thought came to him often, unbidden, a whisper of doubt in the wind. But what was the alternative? To surrender? To crawl away and die in the wilderness he'd been cast into? The image of Croft's smooth face and his son's averted eyes was a fire in his belly. He would not give them the ending they had written for him. He would write his own. He thatched the first section of the roof with thick bundles of prairie grass, tied down with cordage he twisted from yucca fibers. It was a slow, meticulous process, weaving a tight web against the coming snows. Underneath this small, protected space, he built a hearth and chimney from his best stones and clay mortar. The first time he lit a fire, the smoke drew perfectly up the flue. He sat before the small, sputtering flame, the warmth a miracle on his chilled skin. It was the first real warmth he had felt in months. He had created it. He had wrestled it from the ruin. That night, as a cold rain began to fall, he sat dry and warm in his corner, listening to the drops drumming on his thatched roof. It was the sound of sanctuary. He had made a home. It was small, it was crude, but it was his. He had forged it from the wreckage, not just of the cottage, but of his own life. The fire cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, and in their flickering light, Abner saw not an end, but a beginning. The thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney in the hollow did not go unnoticed. To the struggling families in the nearby town of Prospect, a town that was itself on the verge of becoming a ghost, that smoke was a curiosity, then a mystery. Rumors circulated about the old man who had bought the cursed ruin. They said he was mad, a hermit communing with spirits. But the smoke was consistent, a stubborn signal of life in a place that had been dead for decades. A young man named Luke watched that smoke every morning. His own farm was failing, the soil thin and unforgiving. He had a wife and a young daughter, and a gnawing fear that he would not be able to provide for them through the coming winter. He saw in that smoke a persistence that he felt was draining out of him. One day, his curiosity and desperation outweighed his caution. He walked the miles to the hollow, carrying a small sack with a loaf of his wife's bread as a token of peace. He found Abner not communing with spirits, but meticulously shaping bricks from the grey clay and laying them out to dry in the pale autumn sun. He was rebuilding the collapsed north wall, not with salvaged stone, but with new, perfectly formed bricks. Luke stood for a long time, just watching. He saw the immense effort in every movement, the way the old man favored his left leg, the deep lines of pain and concentration etched on his face. But he also saw the incredible precision, the builder's eye, the efficient, waste-free motions. There was no madness here. There was mastery. Abner eventually sensed his presence and straightened slowly, his hand going to the small of his back. He looked at Luke, his eyes clear and assessing, without fear or welcome. They were the eyes of a man who had become entirely self-reliant. Luke held up the sack. "My wife, she baked extra." Abner looked at the bread, then back at Luke's face, reading the story of worry and weariness there. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He did not speak, but he took the bread. Luke stayed for a while longer, watching him work the clay. "That clay," Luke finally said, his voice quiet. "It fires true." Abner picked up one of the dried bricks. It was heavy, solid, and geometrically perfect. He tapped it with a knuckle. The sound was a clean, hard ring, like a bell. "It holds," Abner said. It was the first time Luke had heard him speak. The two words were freighted with meaning. It holds. It endures. It can be trusted. Luke nodded, a seed of an idea taking root in his mind. He left without another word, but as he walked home, he kept hearing that clean, ringing sound in his head. The first snows had fallen, blanketing the hills in a pristine, unforgiving white, when Thomas arrived. He rode a fine horse, a stark contrast to the desolate landscape, and his coat was thick and new. He looked out of place, an emissary from a world that had forgotten this one. He found Abner splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the cold, still air. The cottage was no longer a ruin. The north wall was complete, a patchwork of old stone and new brick, solid and proud. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a defiant signal against the grey sky. Thomas dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow. He looked at the small, sturdy dwelling, at his father's worn clothes and weathered face, and a flicker of something, pity, or perhaps discomfort, crossed his features. "Pa," he began, his voice uncertain. "I wasn't sure I'd find you. We heard, well, we thought." He trailed off, unable to voice the assumption that his father had simply perished. Abner finished splitting the log in his hands, setting the two halves neatly on a growing pile. He turned to face his son, his expression unreadable. He did not invite him inside. "You found me," Abner stated. It was not a question. "This is something," Thomas said, gesturing vaguely at the cottage. "It's not much. I've spoken to some people in town. There's a room for you, at the boarding house. I'll pay for it. You can't stay out here. Not at your age. It isn't dignified. The word hung in the frozen air between them. Abner looked at his hands, at the calluses and scars that were a testament to his survival. He looked at the solid wall he had built, the roof that kept him dry, the firewood that kept him warm. He had earned this. Every splinter, every stone. He had wrested dignity from the dust. "I am building something here," Abner said, his voice low but firm. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of his entire struggle. He was not just surviving, he was creating. Thomas shook his head, a gesture of frustration. "Building what? A mud hut?" "Croft's new venture is bringing the railroad spur through the old ranch. There's progress happening, real progress." This is going backward." Abner looked his son in the eye. For the first time, he saw not a traitor, but a child, one who had mistaken comfort for strength and noise for progress. "Your progress required my ruin," Abner said, his voice devoid of accusation, a simple statement of fact. "My building requires only my own two hands." He turned back to his woodpile, his posture a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Thomas stood for a moment longer, caught between guilt and impatience, before mounting his horse and riding away, leaving his father alone in the vast, quiet snow. Luke returned a week later, not with bread, but with his tools and his two strong arms. He found Abner repairing the wellhead, fashioning a new axle for the bucket pulley. The cold was sharp, and the old man's breath plumed in the air, but his movements were as deliberate as ever. Luke didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stood before Abner, his hat in his hands despite the cold. "Teach me," he said. The words were a plea and an offer. "My land is poor. But there's clay like this on the north end of my property. I've never known what to do with it. Teach me how to make the bricks. Teach me how to build a wall that holds. He paused, then added, I'll work for you. I'll haul your stone, cut your wood. Whatever you need. My family, we need a better house. One that will last the winter. Abner studied the young man's face. He saw the desperation there, but underneath it, he saw the same stubborn spark he recognized in himself. He saw a man willing to trade his sweat for knowledge, not a handout. He remembered his own son's offer of a paid room, a gesture of charity meant to soothe a guilty conscience. This was different. This was a partnership, an exchange of value. Abner gave a slow, single nod. The water in the clay must be right, he said, his first words of instruction. Too much, and the brick slumps. Too little, and it cracks. You have to feel it, and so, the lessons began. Abner taught Luke how to read the clay, how to mix it with the right amount of sand and straw to give it strength. He showed him how to pack the wet mixture into the wooden molds he had made, how to turn the green bricks out to dry, and how to stack them so the air could circulate evenly. He taught him the geometry of a proper kiln, how to build a fire that would heat slowly and evenly, turning the soft clay into something as hard as stone. Luke was a quick study, his youthful strength a perfect complement to Abner's deep, experimental wisdom. Soon, 2 more men from Prospect appeared, drawn by Luke's reports. They were in the same predicament, with failing farms and families to protect. They too offered their labor for Abner's knowledge. The hollow, once a place of solitude and silence, was now filled with the rhythmic sounds of work, the scrape of shovels, the thud of clay being packed into molds, the low murmur of instruction. They were building more than just bricks. They were forging a community out of shared hardship and mutual respect. Abner, who had been discarded as a relic, had become a teacher. His knowledge, deemed worthless by the new world of ledgers and loans, was now the most valuable currency they had. Spring arrived, and with it, a stranger. He rode a horse even finer than Thomas's and wore a suit that seemed immune to the dust of the road. It was Mr. Croft. He dismounted with an air of practiced authority, his polished boots a stark offense to the honest earth of the hollow. He took in the scene with a calculating gaze, the neat stacks of finished bricks, the expanded cottage, the small, sturdy homes that Luke and the others had begun to build for their own families nearby. This was no longer a hermit's hovel, it was a burgeoning settlement, a place of industry and purpose. Croft's eyes, however, were not on the homes. They were on the quarry-like pit from which the men were digging clay and the steady, reliable flow of water from the repaired well. Abner saw him coming and paused his work, wiping his clay-caked hands on his trousers. He stood, flanked by Luke and the other men, who had stopped their own work to watch the intruder. Abner, Croft began, foregoing any greeting. He managed a thin, professional smile. You've been busy. Quite the enterprise you have here. Abner remained silent, letting the banker fill the space with his own agenda. As it happens, Croft continued, the railroad has finalized its plans for the new spur line. They require a significant quantity of high-grade brick for the support abutments and the new depot. And they need a reliable water source for the steam engines during construction. Your little discovery here, it's quite opportune. He paused for dramatic effect. I am authorized to offer you $500 for this parcel of land. A handsome profit on your $7 investment, I think you'll agree. You can take the money, move to town. Live comfortably. The offer hung in the air, a temptation designed for a man who had once been destitute. $500 was a fortune, more money than Abner had seen in years. But Abner looked past Croft's shoulder, at the small, solid houses taking shape on the hillside. He looked at Luke's daughter, who was playing near her new doorstep, safe and secure. He looked at the faces of the men standing with him, men who had rediscovered their own worth through the work of their hands. He had something here that could not be bought or sold. The clay isn't for sale, Abner said, his voice quiet but absolute. Croft's smile tightened. Don't be a fool. This is your last chance to have something. I can have this land condemned. There are ways. And Abner looked at the banker, at his fine suit and his empty promises, and felt a profound sense of peace. He was no longer the man who had stood silently while his life was auctioned off. You have your ways, Mr. Croft, Abner said, his voice calm and steady. "And we have ours." He turned his back on the banker and picked up his trowel. The message was clear. They had work to do. The seasons turned again, and the hollow, once named Redemption in irony, now lived up to its name. The railroad spur was built, but they sourced their bricks from a distant quarry at great expense. Croft did not return. The small community that had gathered around Abner thrived. They built their homes from the earth beneath their feet, sturdy, warm dwellings that mocked the flimsy, hastily built structures in Prospect. They dug irrigation ditches from the well, and their small gardens flourished. The knowledge Abner had passed on had taken root, becoming a legacy of resilience. He was the old man of the mountain, the quiet center of their new world. He no longer worked from dawn until dusk. His body, at 72, demanded a slower pace. He spent his days now sitting by the door of his cottage, the one he had raised from ruin, and offering advice. He taught the children how to feel the clay, how to read the sky for rain, how to listen to the land. His hands, gnarled and scarred, were rarely idle. He would mend tools or twist rope, his movement still precise, still full of purpose. His son, Thomas, came to see him one last time. The new venture had failed, the railroad boom had bypassed their town, and Thomas had lost everything, just as his father had. He stood before Abner, not with arrogance or pity, but with a humility born of defeat. He did not ask for forgiveness or for help. He simply watched his father for a long time. "I didn't understand," Thomas said finally, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I thought building was about tearing something down first." Abner looked up from the harness he was mending and met his son's eyes. He saw the boy he had raised, the man he had lost, and the stranger who stood before him now, broken and seeking. He gestured to the empty stool beside him. "The first lesson," Abner said, his voice gentle, "is that you start with what holds." He had built more than a house, more than a community. He had built a truth that even his son could now see. His legacy was not in the land he had lost, but in the knowledge he had given away. It was in the solid walls of his neighbors' homes, in the laughter of their children, in the quiet dignity of a life rebuilt from the ground up. He had been discarded as worthless, a man whose time was over. But here, in this place of last resort, he had proven that nothing, and no one, is ever truly a ruin. They are merely foundations waiting for the right hands to build upon them again.